the war on drugs starts with a man named Harry Anslinger back in the 30s, I believe. And it's so funny reading about his story. So basically he was part of, during Prohibition, he ran a whole team who were keeping, arresting people for using and selling alcohol, right? Because you weren't allowed to, and it was so funny that, you don't see like the, what does Johanna Marie say? It's like you don't see that the CEO of Budweiser go into the CEO of Smirnoff and shooting him in the face, right? It just doesn't happen because alcohol is legal. There's no need for that kind of, and this is another point. So when you make drugs illegal, it doesn't mean that people don't stop using them. There's such a we've always used drugs. Yeah, from when we were primates, when we were monkeys, we would go and, pick mushrooms off the ground and have some sort of altered state of consciousness. Humans like drugs, right? We can't get around that fact, right? Now, what we need to understand is that Harry Anslinger was a guy who he was racist, even by 1930 standards. He was seen as a racist back then when everyone was fucking racist. That's how bad of a racist he was. So he hated black people. He also hated drugs with a vengeance, right? And why did he hate drugs? Well, it's so funny because what all the work I do in talking is about trauma. I'm obsessed with trauma because I believe trauma is part of our human condition. We're all traumatized to an extent. And if you're looking at drugs or alcohol or gambling or shopping or sex or relationships, codependency, all of these surface level manifestations that we run into issues with all come from trauma. They're all a trauma response at the end of the day. And as I was reading about Harry Anslinger, it just clicked in my head. I'm like, this has all come from his trauma.
Oh, yes, good point.
Because he used to live in some rural part of, might have been Oregon or somewhere in the States, and in like a barn, and the barn next door was, and this is the whole reason that Chasing the Scream was named Chasing the Scream, is that there was an African-American lady who would always scream and yell out, and Harry's dad would tell him, go to the local pharmacy, because you could buy heroin or morphine, it was back then. You could just buy it over the counter, right? And he's like, go and get her a morphine because she's addicted, and she'd be screaming, and he'd get the morphine on his horse and cart, and she'd stop screaming. So he just developed this, and it was a trauma. This is like a 10-year-old boy. This is a traumatic experience. And his response to that trauma is, black people are evil. They're like weak. They have to use drugs, blah, blah, blah. And drugs are evil in of themselves, right? Which is, once again, this is kind of the birth of the war on drugs before that word was ever created. So when Harry's running this department during Prohibition to try and stop people drinking and selling alcohol, he has no problem with marijuana. He actually said, it's not that much of a big deal, people, because you're allowed to use it, once again, legally back then. But then what happened? Prohibition ends. Right? They decide, hey, this whole making alcohol illegal is causing way too much trouble. Let's just make it legal again so we can get the tax, we can regulate it, and all that kind of thing. So now Harry has himself and this whole department that he runs that are going to look like they're not going to have jobs. They're not going to have anything to do because there's no alcohol enforcement needed. So what does he do? He goes after marijuana. This is where it starts. Back then, heroin or morphine and things like cocaine, they were used, but not a great deal. Yeah, you could buy cocaine-related products over the counter as well, but they weren't a big thing. But a lot of people were starting to use, marijuana back then. So he thought, hang on, to keep us in a job, let's see if we can demonize this drug, right? But when I read Harry Anslinger's story, it reminds me so much of Hitler, right? Not on the same scale, but someone who was so full of hate and anger, but thought they were doing the right thing. But in fact, in that pursuit of doing the right thing, they created so much more of what they were trying to stop. And so what happened, he got hold, there was a story of a young fella in America who hacked his family to death with an axe. And so he grabbed that story, went to Hearst, who was, that Randolph Hearst, whatever his name was. He was the big news outlet at the time, and said, look, this is because of marijuana. He took marijuana and hacked his family to death. And it went viral. Like, viral back then was, newspapers and telegraphs and stuff. But basically, he's like, if you use marijuana, you're going to hack your family to death. Years later, they looked into the psychiatric records of this fella. There was never any evidence that he had used marijuana in his life. And actually, he had a family history of psychosis and insanity and stuff. And he was actually, the family was told he should be put in a home a year earlier. And they said no. And, this happened. Anyway, so this started putting fear into people, and this is so prevalent thinking about this stuff now with COVID and all the fear and everything going out there, right? So all of a sudden, marijuana is demonized and now he's drug enforcement. Yeah, as opposed to this just alcohol, now it's marijuana and other drugs. And so he campaigned and made, to make marijuana progressively through each state. Like now it's the reverse is happening. It's slowly becoming legal in more states. He made it illegal progressively in the states by spreading a lot of this fear. And that went on to, heroin and cocaine. And the story that's explained in the book around Billie Holiday, the amazing African-American singer, it breaks my heart. Like I tear up when I hear it. There was many instances of him destroying lives, but Billie Holiday being a very famous, he literally destroyed her life because she was the epitome of what he hated. She was African-American. She was a heroin addict, an alcoholic, but also she was standing up to the white man. She was singing songs about black men being lynched in the streets, in these white cabaret clubs, and she'd get shit thrown at her and she's like, I'm not going to stop fucking singing my song.
Amazing.
I won't go into that full story now, but I really encourage people to look up that story of Harry Anslinger and Billie Holiday because it's horrific. He killed her at the end of the day, right? And tortured her in the process. And so like her story was she was working with her mum as a sex worker at 14. She was being repeatedly raped day in, day out by grown men as a teenager for years and years. And it's like, you talk about trauma, no wonder someone turns to alcohol and then heroin to try and deal with that horrific stuff. And for her to be demonized, it just, it breaks my heart. It's I hate it. It is, and so what happened
as well, though. That I think that actual part is becoming a movie. Thank God, because her story does need to be told. And the way she fell in love with jazz in the beginning, and instead of being paid, she wanted to go down to the basement and listen to jazz music. And again,
I said we won't talk about it, but we will. Let's talk about it because she was singing this song called "Strange Fruit," which was about the lynchings. And, Harry Anslinger's agents went to her and said, you don't fucking sing that song ever again. All right. You don't sing it. And she was she's like, fuck you. I'll sing what I want. This is my art, and Harry Anslinger hated jazz, like the whole genre of jazz, because he saw it as like to disrupt his system and his structure and everything, And so basically Harry Anslinger hated employing anyone in his team of African-American descent, anyone black, but you can't really send a white guy into Harlem undercover to try and make friends with Billie Holiday. So he employed this, can't remember his name now, but he was an African-American fella. He employed him and he went undercover, and his job was to document her drug use and all the shit that she did wrong so she could get busted. He went there and hung out with her, danced with her in the jazz clubs, all that. Billie Holiday was so amazing, he fell in love with her. He was one, as we. And so one of his greatest regrets, he still went through with the bust, and he's regretted it. He regretted it every day of his life after that. And so they busted her, put her in prison. They took away her cabaret license so she couldn't sing. It's like, if you want to torture someone the most, what do? You take away their ability to do what they love. And then anyway, she was in her maybe 40s, and she had to go to hospital. She had liver failure, probably from all the alcohol and everything in her life. And she told one of her friends, she said, Harry Anslinger's men, they'll come for me and kill me in here. So please, watch out. And people were protesting in the streets to let Billie out, and they'd handcuffed her to her hospital bed. She was a heroin addict. So she's like in heroin withdrawal, and her friend is like, can you give her methadone? And she was having methadone, and it was getting better. Yeah, when Harry Anslinger's men come in, cut off her methadone, she died the next day. Just a horrific story about an amazing woman. And it was one of her lines, I think, was, you wouldn't take a type 1 or type 2 diabetic and just ban insulin so they couldn't have it anymore. It's torture. So Harry Anslinger was this guy who was just on this mission he hated drugs. He hated people who weren't white Americans, and he was just out to attack them through these means. And he was a very, like Hitler, he was very influential. He was very powerful because he went to the UN and convinced other countries to adopt these same principles of this war on drugs. Thailand, where I'm living right now, literally went to the UN, and the Thai officials said, look, we don't have a real issue with drugs. You know, we've got a pretty good community-based culture and have, you know, don't really have a drug problem. We don't really want to make drugs illegal and have this war on drugs and criminalize people for it. And he basically said, okay, that's fine, but we'll cut any deals that people had selling things to the US. He'd say, well, we're going to cut all that out if you don't follow suit. So people did, other countries ended up following suit. And so thus we have this war on drugs.